swallow up his humanity. Some people taught that Jesus was God on the inside with a human shell, which would mean that Jesus wasn't truly human, but that he only looked human. This view was taught by a man named Apollinaris, and was known as Apollinarianism. Another challenge was known as monophysitism, coming from mono, one, and physis, nature. This teaching said that Jesus' human nature was lost in his divine nature. So there arose a big controversy about what is the connection, what is the relationship between the human nature of Jesus and the divine nature of Jesus. So the Council of Chalcedon was called in the year 451 to settle the issue. Again, it was held amidst a huge amount of political infighting and backbiting. 400 bishops gathered to decide the issue. Now, I have to admit, if you take a look here at the Council of Nicaea, it's like an all-star team of the survivors and the courageous sufferers of the persecuted church. But fast forward 100 years later to the Council of Chalcedon, where the church leaders have been living in favor and in support from the Roman Empire for 100 years. Do you think it's still as, cutting edge and, godly and all that? No. It had a lot more political infighting and backbiting than the previous Council of Nicaea had had. Well, the Council of Chalcedon gathered together and they settled on this definition. They said that Jesus is, and I'm quoting here, recognized in two natures, without confusion, without change, without division, without separation, the characteristic property of each nature being preserved and coming together to form one person. Basically what they said was that Jesus was fully man and fully God. He didn't lose his humanity in his deity, and he didn't lose his deity in his humanity. The Council of Chalcedon declared that Jesus was God and man, one being with two natures, divine and human. One nature was not absorbed into the other, nor was he really two persons as if somebody had a split personality. In fact, I think this is fascinating. The Council of Chalcedon used the very same word rejected at Nicaea. And I have to say they did it wisely, because what they were reacting against was a Jesus-only doctrine. Do you know what the Jesus-only kind of doctrine is? This kind of, well, I'll just describe it as Jesus-only doctrine. It basically says that God was the Father, that he became Jesus, and that now he's the Holy Spirit. That there is no that there is no Trinity, actually. It just describes three different phases of the same person. Well, the Council of Chalcedon rightly rejected that and came back to the word that was rejected at Nicaea because it emphasized the point they wanted to make of similar substance, emphasizing that God the Father and God the Son are not the same person, right? They're both equally God, but they're not the same person. And again, as much as the Council of Chalcedon was not as glorious as the Council of Nicaea, I think we have to give some high marks to the people of the Council of Chalcedon, because they realized that a word might be appropriate in one creed that's not appropriate in another creed, right? They weren't just going to argue over words, they were getting at the real meanings of the words. So this was a wise thing, again, at the Council of Chalcedon. So we have the Council of Nicaea, where they debated the deity of Jesus Christ. They had the Council of Chalcedon, where they worked through the issue of the humanity of Jesus Christ. Then next, we come to our third important event and challenge of the period of the Christian Empire, and that's tension between Rome and Constantinople. We saw that on previous times when we took a look at the map, right? The Roman Empire established two capital cities in the early 4th century. And there was a natural competition between the two. But between Rome, the western capital, and Constantinople, the eastern capital, right? This is the Roman Empire in the year 400. You can see that it is pretty much a united empire, even though they had administratively divided it between East and West, but yet it was still somewhat of a united empire in the year 400. But the division came between East and West, and the centers of power were Rome in Italy and Constantinople in Asia Minor, or actually right on the edge of Asia Minor. This struggle between the western capital Rome and the eastern capital of Constantinople really engendered sort of a division between the church. And many things divided the western and the eastern branches of Christianity. The West used Latin as its primary language. The East used Greek. They did communion a little bit differently. They used different dates for Easter. They celebrated Mass differently. In the East, clergy could marry. Clergy could wear beards. In the West, clergy were expected to be celibate and expected to be clean-shaven. Over the centuries, the divisions developed to the place where in the year 1054, the head of each, the head of the Western Church, whom we would call what? The Pope, right? The head of the Western Church in Rome excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople and said, "You're not a real Christian." Well, what did the Patriarch of Constantinople do? He excommunicated the Bishop of Rome, and so you have this same practice of them excommunicating one another. This rivalry was so bitter between the two that when Islam finally conquered Constantinople, actually very late, Constantinople held out against Islam for a long time. They did not conquer Constantinople until the year 1453. Some Eastern Christians said, "We would rather become Muslims than become Western Catholics." That's how deep the divisions were between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. Which sort of brings us on to our next category. We've talked about 3 already. Here's our 4th. We talked about the Arian heresy in the Council of Nicaea. We talked about the dispute about the humanity of Jesus in the Council of Chalcedon. We talked about the tension between Rome and Constantinople and this division between Western Christianity and Eastern Christianity. And now we're talking about the emergence of Islam and the Islamic invasion of Europe. You know, in 662, the followers of Muhammad were a persecuted band of visionaries in Arabia. 100 years later, they controlled all of Arabia, all of North Africa, all of the Palestine region, all of Persia, all of Spain, parts of India, and they were threatening France and Northern Europe. This is remarkable to see from a historical perspective, the spread of Islam. If you take a look at here on the map, this green portion that's noted on the map covers this area of Islam. You can see it covering all of the Middle East here area and then sweeping up over North Africa in this mighty way. But look at the difference between 700 and 800, where you have it not only sweeping even more here, but coming up here into Spain and the European peninsula in this mighty push by Islam. And so this was a very aggressive spreading of Islam by the sword. Christian communities in these lands were often persecuted or assimilated by their Islamic conquerors. Over and over again, this was the pattern. Let's not forget that these areas under the days of the Roman Empire and beyond were predominantly Christian, right? There was a time when almost all of these areas were dominated by Christianity.